Welcome to my weekly meta review for Best of 1 Standard, and this is the first week of Outlaws at Thunder Junction, so we get to see how the new cards have shaken up the meta and changed things around. So I like to start things off with the budget list if I have one, and this week I do. So this one is Budget Mono Red Prowess by Saffron Olive, and the rares in the deck are the new Slick Shot Show Off and the Fugitive Codebreaker that we got from Murders at Karlov Manor, and then the rest of it is all just commons. And Mishra's Foundry, which honestly it would make you worse against the matchup in control to take this out, but you could run it with just mountains. But it's a very cheap option, and definitely could use this to climb the ladder. So you've got Kumano faces Kakazan, which is a classic. It deals 1 damage, puts a +1/+1 counter on the next creature that you play. You've got the Monastery Swift Spear, which is an uncommon that also has prowess. So the 3 creatures in the deck all have prowess. And then you have a bunch of combat tricks. So you've got Monstrous Rage, which gives +3/+1 because the monster roll gives +1/+1 the turn that it comes in. And it gives it trample, so they can't just chump block your attacker. You've got Play with Fire, which can be used for removal or for direct damage to face. If you do it to face, you get to scry 1. Antagonize gives you +4/+3 until end of turn. Demonic Ruckus, you can plot on turn 1 and then play it from exile for 0. If you plot a card, you have to wait a turn to play it as a sorcery, but this works nicely on your prowess creatures because it triggers the prowess and then also gives them the +1/+1. We've got Highway Robbery for a little bit of dig, where you can discard a card or sacrifice a land if you're flooding out to draw 2 cards. It also has plot, so you can do it on a different turn. And notably, if you plot a card, it will not trigger prowess because it's an activated ability similar to like channeling. But the turn that you play it from exile, then it will trigger your prowess. Lightning Strike, again, is like Play with Fire. You can hit somebody in the face with this, or you can use it to remove a problematic blocker. Rin's Resolve gives us the ability to dig through our library. Slick Shot Show Off is similar to the Monastery Swift Spear, except for that it has flying, and it gets +2/+0 instead of +1/+1. You can also plot this, and I do recommend that you do, right? Because playing this out as a 1/2 haste that then can get shot by a Play with Fire is less impressive than plotting it and then on turn 3 slamming it down and hitting it with a bunch of combat tricks. Scorching Shot is good removal, 5 damage, but only to a creature for double red. And then again, we are running an ultra low land count because nothing is more than 3 in the deck. And so you've got 17 mountains and 3 Mishra's Foundry. And the Mishra's Foundry really is in there for if you come up against the more controlling matchups where they're running maybe like a Temporary Lockdown or Teamwork Control, running the blanking on the name. The Is It spell that deals damage when you discard a card. But anyway, yeah, definitely worth checking out. Next up on the list is Best of 3, and then I'll cover the Best of 1 decks. So for Best of 3, I like to look at the Standard Challenge tournaments that are held on Magic the Gathering Online, or MODO. And this week we had 2 Standard Challenge 32s and a Standard Challenge 64. So I'll be going over the top 3 of each tournament. And first place was taken down by Esper Midrange by King Harry. And if we compare this one to the last Esper Midrange that I covered in week 9 of Murders at Karlov Manor, which was the last week before we got the new set, we can see that they brought in 2 copies of the Tiny Bones the Pickpocket as one of the new cards. It's a Death Toucher that whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you get to play a non-land permanent from that player's graveyard. And so they're kind of incentivized to not let it through. We're dropping 1 copy of Dinnick Pious Apprentice, which is really good against the mono-red matchups and early aggression. We've got 4 copies of the Duelist of the Mind, which is a star 3 flying vigilance creature where its power is equal to the number of cards that you've drawn this turn. And this is a natural inclusion into the Esper Midrange deck because it combos with Raffine. Raffine triggers an Connive's X, where you draw X cards and then discard X cards, where X is the number of attacking creatures. So you can end up drawing a ton of cards in a single turn, and works very nicely with Duelist of the Mind. We've also got Fairy Mastermind, which can help us draw additional cards. 1 additional copy of Lord Skitter Sewer King. And this one hates on the graveyard as well as creates 1/1s. that get pumped up by your Virtue of Loyalty, which at the beginning of your end step, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control, untap those creatures, and as an instant for 1 and a white, you can create a 2/2 creature token with Vigilance at instant speed for the adventure. And so we've kind of got this go wide pump effect going on. Tishana's Tidebinder was brought in, a single copy of, and as well as one in the sideboard. And that was largely, I think, for the Dimir midrange matchup. And works quite well as long as you have something that has an interesting activated or triggered ability. So you can block something that has an interesting enter the battlefield effect, like in Boros Convoke, Knight Errant of Eos, as well as the Imidane's Recruiter. Aclazot's Deepest Betrayal, we've got a single copy here. This is a good one to stabilize against the early pressure because it has flying and lifelink. And then against the mirror match against other Esper control decks, because it is a recurring threat unless it gets exiled, as long as you can dodge the No More Lies, then Aclazot's is a really good threat. We've ditched one copy of Go for the Throat, down one copy of No More Lies. We were, at the last week, they were exploring bringing in 4 copies of No More Lies. One copy of Get Lost, which gives you some nice enchantment, planeswalker, and creature hate. Ditching the 4 copies of Wedding Announcement, which was considered a staple in the Esper Midrange archetype. And I'm going to be going over my best of 3 sideboard guide this week on Esper Midrange using this list. So if you want even more detail about the specific matchups and when to bring in which cards, that will be out on Friday. We're ditching 1 copy of Virtue of Loyalty. The previous list was running 3. And then as far as the lands go, we got a little bit of a rework because we got the Concealed Courtyard, which is the Orzhov fast land. And so we're bringing in 2 copies of that. We're cutting 1 copy of the Caves of Kolios, which is the Orzhov Painland. And then bringing out the Deserted Beach, which is the Azorius Slowland. And bringing in an additional copy of the Rafine's Tower, which you can cycle later in the game if you already have as much land as you would like. And then also fixes for all of our colors to make the Rafine easier to cast. And then bringing out the 2 copies of Shattered Sanctum, which is the slow land for Orzhov, so having a 2/2 split between the slow and the fast lands. And then ditching the 3 copies of the Wandering Emperor as a planeswalker. So for the best of 3 sideboard, what is going on here? Oh no! Oh no, this is glitched. This must be bugged out. I don't know what that's about. There is a 15 card sideboard, and so I'll do my best to describe the changes. So the previous list was running 2 copies of Aclazot's, and they've decided to bring the one of the copies into the main, so there's still 1 in the sideboard. Ditched the 2 copies of Obscura Interceptor. So you might have to pull this up on AetherHub to follow along. I apologize. But Obscura Interceptor was being explored as a way to get around Cavern of Souls. Being able to bounce something that can't, if it can't be countered, then you can't use your No More Lies, but you could use the Obscura Interceptor to give you a turn by bouncing it back to their hand. That was being explored. It's not being run in this list. Also, they ditched the 1 copy of Shrouded Shepherd, and that was being explored as a way to hate on the Boros Convoke matchup. They brought in an additional copy of Tishana's Tidebinder. Again, that's really good for the Dimir Midrange and Boros Convoke. And took out the 1 copy of Cutdown, the 2 copies of Destroy Evil, 2 copies of Disdainful Stroke, and 1 Temporary Lockdown. So if I remember correctly, they're still running 2 copies of the Temporary Lockdown. And then they're bringing in 2 copies of Negate, 2 Rest in Peace, which luckily I can at least show you what this one is. So Rest in Peace is an enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, exile all graveyards. If a card or token would be put into a graveyard from anywhere, exile it instead. So this is some excellent graveyard hate that we can bring in as a sideboard. Time will tell if it's actually better than the Kutzil's Flanker, because Kutzil's Flanker you could also bring in against mono red, and this one you're not going to do that. But it's a good answer for Temur Control and anything that you need graveyard hate to wreck their strategy. Bringing in 3 copies of Knockout Blow, which is the deal 4 damage, gain 2 life for 3, and it costs 2 less if it targets a red creature. So you're going to be bringing that one in against mono red. and then also against Boros Convoke. Again, if you want the full kind of breakdown of everything for Esper Midrange, look for the video on Friday. And last but not least, there were 2 copies of Gix's Command, which is also a really good one to bring in against the board flood strategies like Boros Convoke. And we're going to be talking about a fair amount of Esper Midrange because it did quite well in week 1 of Outlaws of Thunder Junction. So second place was taken down by Esper Midrange by Bugsy69. And if we compare this one again to week 9, we can see that they dropped the Dinnick down to two copies as well. Dropped the 1 copy of Lord Skitter, so not running that one. Brought in 3 copies of Duelist of the Mine instead of 4. And then 3 copies of Fairy Mastermind, so leaning heavily into that strategy as well, especially because this one is bringing in Urtai Resurrected, which pairs nicely with the Fairy Mastermind. Gix Yawgmoth Praetor for a little bit more card draw triggers, and same deciding to drop 4 copies of the Wedding Announcement, but dropping 2 copies of Virtue of Loyalty down to a single copy. And then as far as the lands go, we've got similar. They dropped 3 Caves of Kolios instead of just 1, so down to a single copy there. Brought in 2 of the Orsov Fastlands. Took out the Deserted Beach, which is the Azorius Slowland. Brought in 2 of the Concealed Courtyards, and ditched an island, and brought in a Rafine's Tower and an additional swamp. So there's still enough basics if you are coming up against the Demolition Fields or the Field of Ruin in Azorius Control. As far as the best of 3 sideboard goes, again, the arena must be glitched right now because it did not. It says it has 15 cards, but is not showing them all. So I apologize for that. But I can still describe what has happened. So they've decided to bring the one of the copies of Aklazot's Deepest Betrayal from the sideboard into the main. So there's still 1 copy in the sideboard. Again, they're cutting the Obscura Interceptor and the Shrouded Shepherd, and bringing in Lauren of the Third Path, which works nicely for the enchantment hate, like Boros Convoke is running the Case of the Gateway Express and the War Leader's Call. And then this is used to be a classic sideboard card to bring in against the Esper Midrange decks, but if we're dramatically decreasing the number of enchantments, then Lauren of the Third Path might not work as well in that matchup. We're bringing in 2 copies of Tishana's Tidebinder. Similarly, this is, I think, a tech really against the Dimir aggro or Dimir midrange deck, which has been quite popular in the tournament scene. And then taking out the 1 Cutdown, taking out the 2 Destroy Evils, taking out all 3 copies of Temporary Lockdown, and bringing in a Negate, 2 Pest Controls, which I wish I could show you, is the black-white, or the Orsov instant destroys all non-land permanents that cost mana value 1 or less. So instead of leaning into the Temporary Lockdown, I think they're exploring Pest Control as a way to deal with Boros Convoke. Then they're bringing in 3 copies of Rest in Peace, the enchantment for Graveyard Hate, and then 1 copy of Gix's Command for some life gain stabilization as well as some board hate. Oh, and maybe I missed this. They did bring 1 of the Gix's Command into the main. All right, 3rd place for the first standard challenge on April 20th was taken down by Boros Convoke by L1X0. And if we compare this one, we have to go all the way back to week 5 at Murders at Karlov Manor. That was the last time there was a top 3 by the Boros Convoke in these standard challenges. And you can see they've dropped the 2 copies of the Lunarch Veteran, brought in 1 copy of the Nurturing Pixie, which is a new card that we got at Outlaws. When it enters the battlefield, return up to 1 target non-fairy, non-land permanent you control to its owner's hand. If a permanent was returned this way, put a +1/+1 counter on Nurturing Pixie. So you could replay your Knight Errant of Eos. You could replay your Imidane's Recruiter. I think there's some interesting targets. You could replay your Case of the Gateway Express for removal again. Some interesting things to do with the bounce. I thought that was kind of an interesting inclusion. 1 copy of the Ocean Frontliner, and down 2 copies of Thalia. So at the time, way back then, way back when, over a month ago, they were exploring bringing in Thalia as a way to hate kind of on Azorius Control, and it's actually pretty good in the mirror match because of the first strike as well. We're ditching 1 copy of the Sanguine Evangelist, so down to a single copy here. And then bringing in one copy of the Legion Extruder, which was a special guest that we got for Outlaws. Artifact, when it enters the battlefield, it deals 2 damage to any target. So you can hit face, you can hit a creature, and then for 2 colorless, you can tap it, sacrifice another artifact, like one of your mini clue tokens, and you create a 3/3 colorless golem artifact creature token. Kind of an interesting way to have maybe like an additional copy of Gleeful Demolition in the deck to have a little bit more payoffs for all of your blood tokens and your clue tokens that your 1-drops make. So curious to see how this one plays. Interesting exploration at the very least. And then we're bringing in 2 copies of the War Leader's Call. The other one was favoring just a case of the Gateway Express. I kind of like the 4-2 split because this is handy against the control matchups. And then we're bringing in an additional copy of Cavern of Souls, bringing in an additional copy of Agonjo, 4 of the new Boros Fast Lands, and cutting 1 copy of Mirix, down 1 mountain, down 1 plains, and down 2 of the Sundown Pass, and down 1 Thran portal. So I think because we got the Boros Fastland, that we are now free of the Thran portal situation in the Boros Convoke deck. So that should cause some rejoicing if this is one of your favorite archetypes. As far as the sideboard goes, we're down the 2 copies of Anointed Peacekeeper, Brutal Cathar, Godric, Lauren of the Third Path, Sun Gold Sentinel, and Thalia, as well as 2 copies of Get Lost. So a very large sideboard rework. We're bringing in 3 copies of Destroy Evil, which is good for the mirror match, any deck that's running Enchantment Hate. Bringing in 2 copies of Invasion of Gobakon, which allows us to kind of, if they're leaning on Wraths, like Teamer controls Ill-Timed Explosion, that's the name of the card, then you can use the Invasion of Gobakon to give all of your creatures indestructible. It doesn't play around Sunfall, but it does play around Depopulate and Ill-Timed Explosion, as well as some of the red Wraths like Brotherhood's End and Burn Down the House. So, and you're going to bring that one in if they're running those cards. Then we've got a second copy of the Legion Extruder, and 2 copies of Knockout Blow, which again works okay as a card to bring in this matchup. And then 3 copies of Urabrask's Forge, which gives us some kind of late game inevitability against the decks that struggle to destroy enchantments. All right, now on to the second standard challenge, and this was another Esper Midrange list, this time by Bullwinkle 6705. Took first place, and if we compare this one, we see a change that I did not see coming, which was to take all 4 copies of the Deep Cavern Bat out, and then bring Dinnik all the way up to 4 copies. And then, so this really shows to me that they're teching against mono red, expecting there to be mono red in this matchup. Because Deep Cavern Bat does not perform particularly well against mono red. And then Dinnik is kind of like the answer for your early aggression. Bringing in 4 copies of the Mastermind, Fairy Mastermind. Cutting the 1 copy of Lord Skitter. Bringing in 2 copies of Tishana's Tidebinder in the main. Again, good against the Boros Convoke and Dimir midrange strategy. And then cutting 1 copy of the Wandering Emperor, but still keeping 2. Cutting No More Lies down to 3 copies from 4. Bringing Virtue of Loyalty up to 4. And then as far as the lands go, we've got Caves of Kolios is down 1. And we've got the 2 copies of the Concealed Courtyard, which seems like the choice as far as Esper Midrange goes. We're bringing out 1 copy of the Rafine's Tower and 1 Restless Anchorage, so dropping that down to a total of 3 copies. And then we're bringing in 1 Seachrome Coast, which is the slow land. Oh no, sorry, Azorius Fastland. And oh, sorry, I lost my spot. And then, oh yes, cutting 2 copies of the Shattered Sanctum. So same thing, doing a 2-2 split between the Orsov slow and fast lands, and then bringing the Underground River up 1. As far as the best of 3 sideboard goes, they cut the Obscura Interceptors. They decided to bring in an additional copy of the Shrouded Shepherd, so up to a total of 2. Again, this one was being explored as an answer for the Boros Convoke strategy. Bringing in an additional Tishana's Tidebinder, so potentially being able to have a total of 3 to bring in against certain strategies. taking out the 2 Destroy Evils, 2 Duress, as well as the 3 Temporary Lockdowns, exploring 3 Long Goodbyes, 2 Negates, 1 Pest Control, and then the Wandering Emperor, the 3rd copy of the Wandering Emperor has been moved to the sideboard. All right, here we go. So second place in the Standard Challenge 32 on the second one was taken down by Rakdos Midrange by Goblin Lackey. And if we compare this one to week 2 at Murders at Karlov Manor, which is the last time we saw top 3 for the Rakdos Midrange archetype, we can see that we brought in 3 copies of the Tiny Bones, the Pickpocket, cut the 1 copy of the Tenacious Underdog, cut the 3 copies of Archfiend of the Dross, as well as the 2 copies of Geological Appraiser, brought in an additional copy of Shieldred, the Apocalypse, and 2 copies of Duress in the main. Cut the 3 copies of Bitter Triumph, and instead are going for the 3 copies or 4 copies of Go for the Throat, so increasing it by a total of 3. And 1 Shoot the Sheriff, which I think is being explored as an alternative to Go for the Throat. And then as far as the lands go, we've ditched the 1 Cavern of Souls, which is here. Prevent people from countering. There hasn't been as much counterspell in the meta, at least at the beginning here, compared to Murders at Karlov Manor. Then we're ditching 2 copies of the Haunted Ridge, which is the slow land for Rakdos. And then we are... keep losing my spot, sorry. We're bringing in 2 copies of Mirix to kind of help improve against the control matchup. Cutting the 2 copies of the Mountains and bringing in 1 more copy of the Restless Vince, which is the Rakdos Manland, and bringing in 1 copy of the Sokenzan Crucible of Defiance, so to a total of 2. Same with Takanuma, so leaning double copies on the legendary lands, and then cutting Lily from the main. As far as the best of 3 sideboard goes, we are bringing in an additional copy of Aklazot's Deepest Betrayal, cutting 1 Brotherhood's End, 2 Extract the Truth, 1 Gix's Command, 2 Path of Peril, 2 Cruelty of Gix, and then bringing in 1 additional copy of Liliana of the Veil, taking out 1 Obnixilis the Adversary, and bringing in 1 copy of Obliterating Bolt, and 2 copies of Unlicensed Hearse, and 4 copies of Hidetsugu Consumes All. And I wish I had that one. You'll have to look it up online. I apologize again. It's a interesting Rakdos Wrath. And so that one was being explored as a way to kind of answer the go wide board strategy, I imagine. All right, third place was taken down by another Esper Midrange deck, this time by Boy. And but it was the same exact list as the one by King Harry, so we won't be covering that one. But showcases you just how many of the top 3 were taken down by Esper Midrange. First place for the Standard Challenge 64 on April 21st was taken down by Domain by Ruby Exilia. And if we compare this one to week 9, we can see that they've ditched the 3 copies of Glimpse the Core, which was being explored to ramp, and bringing in 1 copy, an additional copy of Depopulate, and 2 copies of Spelunking, so that our tap lands do not enter tapped. And then bringing in a single copy of the Mountain and cutting 1 Plains, cutting 1 Rafine's Tower. Which I guess was the only one. And then bringing in 1 Ziatora's Proving Ground from 3 to a total of 4. So still 26 lands. And as far as the best of 3 sideboard goes, they've ditched the 2 copies of the Chromos Sea Shark, the 4 Kutzel's Flankers, again exploring Rest in Peace instead of Kutzel's Flanker, the 2 copies of Tranquil Frillback, and which could also hate on the graveyard, 2 Temporary Lockdowns, and instead bringing in 4 Long Goodbyes, which is the destroy target creature 3 or less and it can't be countered, so giving us some more spot interaction, kind of like Go for the Throat. 3 copies of Rest in Peace, so even though it's just showing 2 here, it's actually 3. And then 1 Realmbreaker, the Invasion Tree, and this is really for the more grindy matchups. When you come up Domain versus Domain, it commonly goes to Mill. Or it's not uncommon to go to Mill, I should say. So 1 copy of Realmbreaker. And then 2 copies of Elish Norn, Mother of Machines, which is the 4/7 Vigilance that makes your ETBs trigger twice and then makes your opponents not happen. So it's a very good sideboard option to bring in against the Timur control deck, because then their landfall triggers don't happen. And you can also bring it in against the Boros Convoke strategy. Speaking of Boros Convoke, second place was taken down by Sapoa with Boros Convoke. And let's see, if we compare this one, we have to go all the way back to week 5. And Boros Convoke has been a popular choice in the tournament scene. It just hasn't done particularly well in the standard challenges specifically. But this one has dropped 2 copies of the Lunarch Veteran, brought in 1 copy of the Yoshin Frontliner, ditched the 2... Sorry, for a second there, I thought I was repeating the same list. There are some changes between this one and the other one that we just covered. So yeah, bringing out the 2 copies of Thalia, bringing in a Nim Pakal instead as kind of the tech to explore, and then bringing in 2 copies of Get Lost instead of just 1, and then bringing in 4 copies of the Inspiring Vantage, again with the Boros Fastland, bringing in 1 additional copy of Mirix, cutting a Mountain and a Plains, and then cutting the 2 copies of the Sundown Pass and the Thran Portal. So again, both lists deciding finally getting rid of the Thran Portal. And then as far as the sideboard goes, they've ditched the Anointed Peacekeeper, the Brutal Cathar, Godric, Lauren of the Third Path, and the Sun Gold Sentinel, and as well as the other 2 copies of Thalia. And instead are running an additional copy of In the Festivities. Can't quite remember the total count off the top of my head. But bringing in 4 copies of the Invasion of Gobakon, again, really good against the Depopulate and Ill-Timed Explosion and anything other than Sunfall. Bringing in 1 copy of Lantern Flare as a way to, since this board state goes wide very well, and you can deal X damage to target creature or planeswalker, and you gain X life, which can be really nice and very handy to stabilize against some of the other aggro matchups. And then bringing in 3 copies of the Knockout Blow for the mirror match, as well as for the mono red matchup. All right, and the last best of 3 deck to cover is Domain by Sean Danger. Took down 3rd place in Standard Challenge 64. And if we compare this one to week 9, they've decided to cut the 1 copy of Imidane's Recruiter and the 3 copies of Glimpse the Core, as well as taken up the Beanstalk down to 2 copies. And took out the 1 copy of Depopulate and the 2 copies, brought in 2 copies of Virtue of Persistence, as well as 2 copies of Go for the Throat, which we've seen before, usually anticipating mono red. So again, I think there were more people anticipating kind of a resurgence of mono red. Mogged at the end of Murders at Karlov Manor did take down 1st place. So, and we did see actually an increase in mono red in the tournament scene. So not a bad speculation. Brought in 2 copies of Long Goodbye, again, to help slow things down, good against the early aggression. And then we brought in 2 copies of Pest Control in the main. So here I get to finally destroy all non-land permanents with mana value 1 or less, and you can cycle it, which is what I think really puts this card over the top from Temporary Lockdown, is that if you aren't up against Boros Convoke, then it's not a dead card. You can just cycle it. And this deck, you've got a fair amount of lands that you can just cycle as well. So part of it is you can use it to just draw into your threats later, and it answers certain problematic boards. So I do still think it's probably going to be a sideboard card instead of in the main, but maybe they were anticipating a lot of Boros Convoke. Let's see. Oh yeah, brought in 2 copies of the Sunset Revelry, which is one that we don't usually see outside of the Azorius Control decks, but is a good answer for any of the go wide or aggressive strategies. And then we've got they're cutting the 2 copies of Invasion of Zendikar, so just getting rid of the Topiary Stomper Invasion of Zendikar plan entirely, and going in instead in a little bit more of like bringing in some more black for some spot removal. So kind of an innovative take. And then they cut the 1 copy of the Boseiju Who Endures. They cut the 1 Forest and 1 Plains, and 1 Rafine's Tower, to bring in 2 additional copies of a Swamp, as well as Ziatora's Proving Ground up from 3 to 4. As far as the best of 3 sideboard goes, they also cut the 2 copies of the Chromho Sea Shark, the 4 copies of the Kutzel's Flanker, the 2 copies of the Tranquil Frillback, the 3 copies of Negate, and the 4 copies of Temporary Lockdown. And so I think that's an entire sideboard rework. To bring in 2 copies of Cutdown, 4 copies of Duress, 2 copies of Sunset Revelry, so we could bump that up to a total of 4 if it is a favorable matchup to do so. 2 copies of Up the Beanstalk, so not getting rid of them entirely, just moving them to the sideboard. And then bringing in 2 copies of Depopulate. And honestly, I'm surprised to see Depopulate in the sideboard and Pest Control in the main. I would have anticipated them the other way around. But yeah, deciding to bring in this Depopulate when it's favorable, and then 1 Obstinate Baloth if they are playing something that makes you discard, like Lily. All right, now we're into the best of 1, which is great because then the sideboard bug doesn't matter. So this is going to be going off of the tracker data, and so some of the new cards are going to take a little while to filter down into best of 1. Usually you see a little bit more innovation happening in best of 3 first, which is why I like to cover best of 3. Even for best of 1 players, there are some interesting insights that you can kind of use to anticipate your matches, as long as you understand what is good against the best of 1 meta. Again, a reason to watch the best of 3 sideboard guide, even if you are a best of 1 player. There's some interesting information, and that's why I do it. It's something that I think helps me be a better player, and I hope can be helpful to you as well. So with that aside, so number 1, according to Untapped, which is a tracker that I like that follows Magic the Gathering data, the number 1 was Mono Red Prowess, and this is not a replacement for Mono Red Aggro. This is just a new archetype, and it is centered around the Slickshot Show-Off, just like the Mono Red Prowess budget deck at the beginning. But this one has a little bit more rares because you're bringing in like Godric. Honestly, it's not that much more of it's pretty budget as well. So this one's a new archetype. It's very similar to the budget list that we just covered, and basically is doing the same exact strategy, except for it's bringing in Godric as well, which can turn into a 4/4 flying dragon and deal a bunch of damage. And notably not running the Mishra's Foundries, and all the way down to 18 land, because this is a very low curve, and this is best of 1, not best of 3. You can really take advantage of that, and you cheat all the way down to 18 lands. So ultra low, ultra fast. I know this deck can get a turn 3. I have not played it myself, but I have played up against it, and it is definitely here to stay. Number 2, according to Untapped, is Mono Red Aggro. And if we compare this to Week 8 at Murders at Karlov Manor for the best of 1 list, we do see a couple of changes. So that we've gone back, we've reverted to bringing in the 1 copy of the Shivan Devastator, which does pair with the Godric being able to pump all dragons with +1/+0, and bringing in 1 copy of the Bloodthirsty Adversary, just 1, and cutting 1 Charming Scoundrel as well as 1 Felden. Bring in 2 Fugitive Codebreakers, and bringing the Lightning Strikes back up to 4. The previous list was Exploring, bringing it down to 3. And then cutting 1 copy of Witchstalker's Frenzy, so we're just running 2. And sometimes you come up against a deck that doesn't have a whole lot of creatures. So this can't hit Planeswalkers. So against like Azorius Control, it can be pretty bad to have in your deck. So I can get behind having only 2 copies of it. But then for the lands, we've ditched 1 mountain, 2 Mishra's Foundries, and brought in a Sokenzan Crucible of Defiance. So we're running 20 lands instead of 22, and leaning more heavily on that best of 1 hand smoother. So number 3, and this is what I mean by like, there's not a lot of new cards in the Mono Red or the Azorius Control, because the spikes, the people who really want to win, are everyone was just jamming the stuff that they knew did well, as everyone else explored other stuff, like I did with the Is It Pirates deck. So Azorius Control was number 3, and if we compare this one to Week 8, we do see some changes, although no new Outlaws cards. So Wandering Emperor up to total of 4, bringing in the 4 copies of Jace, going for more of the mill strategy if you are up against another control matchup. Also works relatively well as a win condition against Temur Control, because as they're doing all of those landfalls, they're thinning their deck, so you can usually get a Jace mill win against that archetype as well. Bringing in 2 copies of the Sunset Revelry as an attack against Mono Red, bringing in 1 copy of Farewell as a way to kind of have some graveyard hate, as well as occasionally we're seeing a little bit more of Azorius artifacts popping up here and there. And cutting 1 copy of the March of Otherworldly Light. Again, this one is a really handy one to have against Boros Convoke because you can remove their token that they target with Gleeful Demolition. And so that's a nice early answer for that. We're bringing in 4 copies of the Soul Partition, which allows us to have kind of some spot removal that then we can then stall into our later board wipes. Running 1 copy of Negate in the main, and then cutting the 3 copies of the Hornlock Whale, and 4 copies of Deduce. No, not and the Disruption Protocol. So kind of ditching the artifact strategy and the card draw strategy through that. Bringing in 3 copies of Temporary Lockdown, and as our answer to like Boros Convoke. And then as far as the land goes, we've cut a Darkar Waste down by 1, cut 1 Agonjo from the list. No, none of those. Cut 2 Field of Ruins in favor of bringing in the 4 Demolition Fields, and brought in 2 islands, cut 2 Meticulous Archive, which was the Surveil tap land from Murders at Karlov Manor, and then cut the 3 copies of Mirix. So really answering our opponent's manlands more so than having our own. And I think this is largely because we haven't seen a whole lot of Azorius Control. It's mostly been Boros and red deck wins, or mono red aggro, or the new Prowess red deck in the first week. So, the meta will shift over time, but this is the top performing Azorius archetype. Top performing Azorius archetype according to the tracker. Number 4 was Boros Convoke, and if we compare this one to Week 9 at Murders at Karlov Manor, the best of 1 list, we can we brought back in the 2 copies of Lunarch Veteran, and I think this has to do with there being just a ton of mono red. Near the end of Murders at Karlov Manor, mono red was not quite as prevalent. It still was one of your more common matchups, but there was a lot more control on the ladder, myself included. And then we brought in 1 copy of the Regal Bunnycorn. Again, certain matchups can really struggle with a large Bunnycorn, on a red being one of them. And then Sanguine Evangelist as a board pump, bringing this up to 3 copies, bringing in 3 copies of Warleader's Call instead of the Case of the Gateway Express. So I've seen a lot of best of 1 lists not doing like the 4-2 split, but kind of choosing either or. And so with like Lunarch Veteran, you're better against the early aggression, where the Case of the Gateway Express kind of helps you remove a problematic blocker. Warleader's Call is better if your next most common matchup is Domain or Azorius Control or Temur Control, because unless they counter your Warleader's Call, this does ping them for 1 damage and then gives you that +1/+1 board pump, and so works better in the more grindy matchups. So we're ditching the 4 copies of the Case of the Gateway Express, and then for the lands, we've brought the Cavern of Souls all the way up to 4, ditched 1 copy of the Agonjo, Seed of the Empire, so back down to 1 copy, and Mirix down 1, as well as 1 Mountain down 1, and then Sokenzan as well. The legendary lands were being explored as copies of 2, and they're back down to copies of 1. And then this one is still running the 4 copies of Thran Portal, and has 23 lands instead of 22. I do imagine as the time goes on, like I mentioned, this is data from last week that was people using the Boros Convoke before they brought in the Outlaws of Thunder Junction cards. So once we have, this will be replaced, as we saw in Best of 3, by the Boros Fastland. Number 5 was Selesnya Enchantments, and if we compare this to Week 8 at Murders of Karlov Manor, it's gone up 2 copies of Brushland, down a Forest and down a Plains, down an Overground Farmland for a 4th copy of the Razor Verge Thicket. And basically all we've seen for a while now is whether or not the last thing to be figured out is the lands. And I don't think even to this point, I don't think the ideal land situation has been figured out entirely, because that's all we've seen kind of change throughout the weeks. The rest of the board is here to stay until the rotation happens in September. So until that happens, we're basically, this has been figured out. And if you want a consistent top 8 deck to climb the meta with, This has been, this has been good, and nothing has really come into the meta to upset it. So you're gonna still bump into Selesnya Enchantments. In case this is a meta review for you for the first time you're returning to Outlaws at Thunder Junction, it's just enchantment synergies centered around like the Weaver of Harmony, Jukai Naturalist, and Calyx are your big ones. So Weaver of Harmony can use the removal of ossification and duplicate it. And then Weaver, the Jukai Naturalist can get pumped up by Mashiko and given trample by Audacity to hit for a ton of damage. And then you've got Calming of Transience and Generous Visitor, which kind of grow these threats every time that you're playing an enchantment. And you can do the Spirited Canyon, which you can also copy with the Weaver of Harmony to draw a card. So this one's been a while. This has been around basically since Neon Dynasty. And then we got this in Aftermath, I believe. And then this allows us to also copy ossification if this or a creature that's been enchanted with Audacity connects. Like you can put Audacity on a Kami of Transience and get in that way, and do some really absolutely disgusting loops. And then you've got one copy of Catilda, which gives you some lifelink and can help stabilize, and then also comes back as an enchant creature. All right, number 6 was Mono Black Aggro, and this is pretty similar to the one that I covered back in week 3 at Murders at Karlov Manor. This one's been hanging around in the top 8 all throughout Murders at Karlov Manor, but it hasn't really made it into the top 3. So this one, compared to week 3, is running 2 additional swamps and cutting 2 Mishra's Foundry. The rest of the list is exactly the same. Again, we're just kind of focusing on early aggression, so running like Skull Dweller, the Dream Thief, Deep Cavern Bat to destabilize, a whole bunch of point removal, which makes it good against the mono red strategy. Tenacious Underdog can be a recurring threat that some boards struggle with removing. Preacher of the Schism is kind of the bread and butter, really, that allows you to just overwhelm your opponent. Liliana of the Veil is good at attacking your opponent's hand if it's a control matchup, and then good at removing threats if you're up against more of a mid-range deck. Gix allows us to use our early flyers like Dream Thief and the Cavern Bat for card advantage. If you have Shieldred in play, you don't even have to pay life. In fact, you actually gain life. And then you've got Gix's Command, which helps against like Boros Convoke. Aclazotz, again, one copy of Aclazotz is pretty common and is good against the mono red and Boros Convoke strategies. And then we've got Virtue of Persistence, which is early point removal that gains us life and then turns into a late game threat where we can start bringing back our Shieldreds and such. And technically speaking, there were 2 budget lists. This one's just not a new one. But if you haven't bumped into this one and you're kind of new and returning back to Magic, I can highly recommend the Mono Blue Tempo list. The one I started out at the beginning of the video is less tested than this one. This one has been in the top 8, which is really good for a deck that has no rares. So this one decided to bring in 1 rare, which you don't have to play over an island. That's the only change that's occurred, is bringing in Otawara, which is kind of free if you have it. Otherwise, what you're looking to do is you're looking to play an early flyer or something with evasion that you can then ninjutsu to play your Moon Circuit Hacker and then replay it to get another map token. The other thing that you can do is do the Prosperous Thief, which the whole point is you're trying to create these artifacts so that on turn 3, you can have something to animate with Zoetic Glyph, which becomes a 5/4, and then if they Wrath the board, you still get Zoetic Glyph, even if they Sunfall, because the enchantment goes to the graveyard, which then leaves you something on the board, which then kind of negates the whole purpose of the Wrath. You can play Zoetic Glyph on the Hover Bike, but this is more of a tap card, similar to like Fading Hope and Machine Over Matter for disrupting your opponent's plays. But you can also put it on a Ginger Brute and then make it so that that 5/4 is unblockable. So if you haven't played with this list, it's a lot of fun. I did a 50-match summary of it back during Lost Caverns of Ixalan, if I remember correctly, and can definitely recommend this deck. All right, and we're finally to the end. I mean, that was like 17 decks or something like that. It was absolutely nuts, right? So always love week 1. It's crazy to see the innovation that's going on, and it's always a fun time when a new set comes out. So that's why we're going deep on this episode and trying to get it done in under an hour. So we'll see how it goes. We're close. So the last one, number 8, was mono black skeletons, and so similar to mono red, we have a second mono black archetype, and this one is leaning more heavily into some of the cards that we got at Outlaws at Thunder Junction. So we've got 4 copies of Tiny Bones the Pickpocket, which is the death touch that can bring something back, or you can play from your opponent's graveyard. If it damages them, you can play a creature from their graveyard, or non-land permanent. We've got Tiny Bones Joins Up, which has been seeing play in more and more decks, like the off meta, the meta breakers that I covered yesterday. This allows you to commit a crime when it enters the battlefield, and then also commit a crime every time that you're playing a legendary creature. So it naturally synergizes with some of your cards that require you to commit a crime. So it makes them discard a card, and then whenever legendary enters the battlefield, each player mills a card and you lose 1 life. For example, Forsaken Miner, whenever you commit a crime, you may pay 1 black. If you do, return it from the graveyard to the battlefield. You get a nice, aggressive 2/2 threat, recurring threat. Cult Conscript, kind of still similar recurring thing. Case of the Stash Skeleton is a 2/1 menace skeleton that then if the skeleton dies, you can sacrifice the case to go tutor for something in your deck and put it into your hand. Really great way to find Gisa later in the game. We've got Go for the Throat and Cut Down, 4 copies of each for disrupting mono red, basically. And then we've got 4 copies of Corpses of the Lost to give all of our skeletons, which they're, this is a skeleton. The skeletons that spawn off of Gisa, like there's a skeleton sub theme that's going on in this deck specifically. And then we've got 4 copies of Gisa, which is a 4/4 ward 2, pay 2 life for 3 double pip black. Skeletons and zombies you control get +1/+1 and have menace. Whenever you commit a crime, create 2 tapped zombie creature tokens that get the +1/+1 in menace. So you get 2 3/3s that they're tapped the turn of, and then if you commit a crime during your opponent's turn, which I'm not sure if this deck is actually set up to do, well, use a Go for the Throat at instant speed on their turn. You can trigger this multiple times, so it's only once each turn, but you can do it during your opponent's turn too. So Gisa the Hellraiser can create some just absurd board states very quickly. So, and then as far as the lands go, we've got 1 copy of Takanuma, and then 2 copies of the Field of Ruin for a little bit of land hate, and then 2 copies of the Sandstorm Verge. And you might be scratching your head about, like, why would the Field of Ruin be in here? And the reason is because if you destroy target non-basic land that an opponent controls, you're committing a crime. So it triggers your Gisa, it triggers your Forsaken Miner. And same thing with the Sandstorm Verge. You can make something not block, and then because you're targeting your opponent's stuff, it commits a crime. So it's kind of a crime skeleton deck. That one was number 8. So, oh, we did it, guys, in under an hour. Let's go. Oh man. So every Sunday I'm going to be doing these kind of meta breakers or off meta picks like I did yesterday, and that's the one that I'm going to be picking from the 50 match summary. So if you really want one of these to be showcased in the 50 match summary, let me know and I'll do my best to make that happen. Otherwise, this is really just for your knowledge so that you know what are the most common decks that you're going to bump into in the best of 3 and best of 1 ladder and tournament scene. So I hope it's useful information. I hope you enjoyed it. It does take a fair amount of time to put these together. And so thank you, everybody, for supporting me in one way or the other. I greatly appreciate it. Thank you to my YouTube members, my Twitch subscribers, my Patrons, just anybody who's joined in the community, even you watching to the end of the video. So thank you. And I will be back next week to cover the changes to these decks as they occur throughout the weeks and cover more of the best of 3 scene. So look for me next Monday if this is your jam, and enjoy Outlaws of Thunder Junction. Good luck with your matches and RCQs and climbing the ladder. Take care.